Wow. Thank you, Rachel and Yashasvi, for that powerful anthem, Glory. And I thank all of you for joining us in worship this morning, especially our River Road siblings. This is a wonderful way to come together and mark our commitment to this work of racial justice and being anti-racist. I especially want to also recognize Reverend Amanda Weatherspoon and Cliff Harden and other River Road staff who are also on the chat, and also our Cedar Lane staff, Tim Atkins, Reverend Katie Romano Griffin, Stephanie Williams, and others. It is good to be together. Before I begin, let me just say that it would take way more than a 20-minute sermon to move us from being not racist to being anti-racist. Not that I haven't tried, which I have for over 22 years now, and I'm yet to see that kind of a spiritual and prophetic impact of my words. In fact, I remember early in my ministry at the UUs of Clearwater, I preached a sermon called Why I Am Racist and So Are You. Luckily, they were a wonderful congregation that were very accepting and affirming of my ministry. Otherwise, I would have lost my job there. That's just one story among many of my journey toward wholeness and belonging in this wonderful, beautiful, and broken faith of ours. But my hope this morning is to introduce you to some ideas that might support you on your journey. Because we all arrive from different places in anti-racism work. You know, some of us are already tired of talking about race and systemic racism and white supremacy. Some of us think we are already there and that I'm preaching to the choir. Others of us are still learning not to shut down or turn off when the subject makes us uncomfortable. But many of us are committed to journeying on a new path of learning, deepening, and growing into our highest anti-racist ideals as Unitarian Universalists, especially in this very critical time in our nation. So here goes. On July 17th, civil rights leaders Congressman John Robert Lewis and the Reverend Cordy Tyndall, C.T. Vivian, died hours apart from each other. Both leave behind a legacy of racial justice activism that played a crucial role in shaping America's civil rights movement, the Second Reconstruction. Their deaths come at a critical moment in US history amid a moral, social, and political reckoning on Black dignity and life that represents what Bishop William Barber calls the Third American Reconstruction. Their lives and their work provide lessons for us today on how to be an anti-racist and how to confront and dismantle systemic racism and build the beloved community where all are welcome. So how do we honor their legacy? The late Toni Morrison, in a tribute to the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., writes about the time Martin Luther King III, Dr. King's oldest child, asked her, "If you were having a conversation with my father, what would you like to ask him?" Now, for whatever reason, she found herself saying, "I hope he's not disappointed in me." I was not responding, she writes, to the preacher he was, or the scholar he was, or the vulnerable human being he was, nor to the political strategist, the orator, the brilliant risk-taking activist, but I was responding to his mission, his audacious faith. Would he be disappointed in me? The answer isn't important, she continues. But the question really is, and that is the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. He made the act of assuming personal responsibility for alleviating social harm, ordinary, habitual, and irresistible. My tribute to him is the profound gratitude I feel for that gift. End of quote. Like Dr. King, Congressman Lewis had an audacious faith. He made the act of assuming personal responsibility for alleviating social harm ordinary, habitual, and irresistible. So our tribute to him and Reverend Vivian is to express deep gratitude for their gifts, yes, and to commit to do the difficult work, the necessary work of getting in the way of oppression and injustice, of being anti-racist. So what does it mean then to be an anti-racist? First of all, understand what racism and white supremacy mean. In his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, Dr. Ibram X. Kendi defines racism as a marriage of racist policies and racist ideas that produce and normalize racial inequities. Racism takes several forms and works most often in tandem with at least one other form to reinforce racist ideas, behaviors, policies. Types of racism are individual racism, which refers to the beliefs, attitudes, and actions of individuals that support or perpetuate racism in conscious and unconscious ways. The US cultural narrative about racism typically focuses on individual racism and fails to recognize systemic racism. Then there is institutional racism, which involves policies, practices, and procedures of institutions that result in inequitable opportunities and impacts based on race, produced and perpetuated by institutions. Individuals within institutions take on the power of the institution when they act in ways that advantage and disadvantage people based on race, either consciously or unconsciously. Systemic or structural racism is the overarching system of racial bias across institutions and society. It is the normalization and legitimization of an array of dynamics, history, cultural, institutional, and interpersonal that routinely advantage white people while producing cumulative and chronic adverse outcomes for people of color. It is a system of hierarchy and inequity, primarily characterized by white supremacy. Now, systemic racism is more difficult to locate in a particular institution because it involves the reinforcing effects of multiple institutions and cultural norms, past and present, continually producing new and reproducing old forms of racism. And then white supremacy, which is an historically based, institutionally perpetuated system of exploitation and oppression of nations and people of color by nations and people of the European continent for the purpose of maintaining and defending a system of wealth, power, and privilege. End of quote. Now, those who study white supremacy liken it to an iceberg. Slavery, the US genocide of indigenous peoples, the Ku Klux Klan, the neo-Nazis, lynching, hate groups, tiki torches, those are just the visible tip of the iceberg. Below the water surface is where we find the bulk of white supremacy. The structures and systems that are in place that privilege whiteness and white people to protect the status quo. Stuff like the legacy of Jim Crow laws mandating segregation, the new Jim Crow of mass incarceration, police brutality, gerrymandering, the Electoral College, the ongoing impact of redlining and housing discrimination, the longstanding economic inequality, voter disenfranchisement, and much, much more. So being anti-racist means to organize and act against the oppression of Black people, indigenous people, and people of color, and against white privilege. Second, stop saying, I am not racist. Dr. Kendi writes, how many of us say we are not racist after expressing there is something wrong with one of the racial groups, after judging different racial groups from our own socio-cultural standards, after refusing to believe equal opportunity will produce equal outcomes among racial groups, after supporting race-neutral policies that yield racial inequity? Now, I have lost count of how many times I have heard that phrase, I am not racist. I don't have a racist bone in my body, usually followed by the coordinating conjunction, but. I am not racist, but I have read that Black people take advantage of the welfare system more than others. And more recently, I am not racist, but I believe all lives matter. Calling oneself not racist, Dr. Kendi explains, signifies neutrality. You're not a racist, but neither are you against racism. The opposite of racist, he says, isn't not racist, it is anti-racist. So what's the difference? He explains. All policies, ideas, and people are either being racist or anti-racist. Racist policies yield racial inequity. Anti-racist policies yield racial equity. Racist ideas suggest racial hierarchy. Anti-racist ideas suggest racial equality. A racist is supporting racist policy or expressing a racist idea. An anti-racist is supporting anti-racist policy or expressing an anti-racist idea. A racist or anti-racist, he says, is not who we are, but what we are doing in the moment. Third, identify racial inequities and policies that keep them in place. Dr. Kendi says, racist policies are written and unwritten laws, rules, procedures, processes, regulations, and guidelines that maintain racial inequity in every sector of private and public life, including politics, healthcare, the judicial system, education, employment, homeownership, and religion. Being anti-racist means learning about and identifying inequities and disparities that give, in particular, white people or any racial group material advantages over people of color. For example, when Social Security was created in 1935, it excluded domestic and agricultural workers, the majority of whom were Black, which meant that Black workers had less opportunity over the course of decades to accumulate savings and wealth compared to white workers. Other policies that disproportionately provided quote unquote tax-funded wealth building opportunities to white Americans produced similar results for Black Americans. For example, more than 1 million Black World War II veterans were denied the benefits of the GI Bill. So once you've begun identifying racial disparities, examine whether your own views, beliefs, or voting patterns have justified or promoted racial inequity. If you don't know whether your beliefs or views are racist, listen to frontline racial justice activists, advocates, and organizations that have outlined anti-racist positions and policies. Like, for example, the Movement for Black Lives' 2020 policy platform, which in part demands an end to the war on Black people, on Black youth, on Black women, on Black trans, queer, gender nonconforming, and intersex people, on Black health and disabled people, on Black migrants, and demands an end to the death penalty, the war on drugs, pretrial detention and money bail, and the militarization of law enforcement. Let that listening prompt deeper reflection about why you have believed in certain ideas. Fourth, develop the stomach and spiritual muscles needed to confront and prosecute racist ideas you have held or continue to hold. Dr. Kendi explains that racist ideas make one person responsible for the perceived behavior of racial groups and makes racial groups responsible for the behavior of individuals. And he offers many searing examples of his own racist behavior throughout the book. Now, a racist idea that I hold is the idea that one person can represent an entire community. Let me explain. So every time I hear about a mass shooting or an armed robbery or a murder or any crime, I say to myself, please don't let it be a Black person or a person of color or an immigrant or a Muslim. My fear is that the actions of one person will somehow reflect on the entire community, will somehow reflect on me. Conversely, when a white store worker follows me or my wife down an aisle at a department store, yes, it happens right here in Montgomery County. When we don't know what we want to get, but know that person is thinking that we are going to try to steal something, I think to myself, why don't white people trust us? As if all white people distrust all people of color. This is how racist ideas work. Now, the point Dr. Kendi is trying to make is to stop thinking of the term racist as a pejorative term, and instead to start thinking of it as a simple description, so that we can start proactively engaging in the difficult work of becoming anti-racist rather than get stuck in shame or guilt or denial. Now, one way we could do this is to keep an anti-racism journal that includes daily notes about when we took an anti-racist stance or action, and when we thought or said something racist or stayed silent when we saw something racist or something racist being said or participated in racism. Fifth, understand how your anti-racism needs to be intersectional. Because race intersects with multiple aspects of people's identities, including their gender identity, sexual orientation, age, ethnicity, class, religion, nationality, and immigration status, it is imperative to use an intersectional approach when being anti-racist. Not for altruistic reasons, but out of intelligent self-interest, to quote Dr. Kendi. He explains that it is in the intelligent self-interest of white Americans to challenge racism, knowing they will not be free of sexism, class bias, homophobia, transphobia, and ethnocentrism until Black people are free of racism. Sixth, advocate for anti-racist ideas, policies, and actions. Friends, you cannot think your way into being an anti-racist or read your way into being an anti-racist. You cannot be an anti-racist without action. Dr. Kendi says that one way to act is by getting involved and or supporting organizations in our community that are fighting policies that uphold racial inequities. He also recommends using one's power and privilege to become socially and politically active by getting into a position of power to change racist policies in any setting where they exist, be it government or school or work or a religious community, to work to change policy. The point is to commit to some form of action that has the potential to change racist policies. As Congressman John Lewis would say, if you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, say something, do something. Being anti-racist is not a one-time event or decision or epiphany or an identity we ever finally and fully achieve or arrive at. It is a commitment, a lifelong commitment, an ongoing practice and process. In his essay, "This is what an anti-racist America would look like. How do we get there?" Dr. Ibram Kendi lays out a powerful vision of an anti-racist society, which is what I close my reflection with. The vision of an anti-racist society where racism is no longer intersecting with other bigotries to manipulate people away from their self-interests, where we reframe the achievement gap as the opportunity gap, where instead of standardizing our tests or closing our schools, we standardize resources and open first-class schools for all, where we honestly share our racial history, where free, high-quality healthcare is as universal as living wages and fresh food, where instead of stocking prisons with poor and mentally disabled people of color, we stock those communities with high-paying jobs and mental health services, where guns are as controlled as police officers fearing for their lives, where voting is easy and accessible for all citizens, where love and hope guide us instead of fear and white fragility, where we recognize biological and behavioral group sameness, where native and immigrant become one, and where all can be fully human through embracing humanity fully. People like Reverend Vivian and Congressman Lewis strove for this vision in how they lived their lives. They have now crossed that final bridge, but we are still here. It is up to us now, together, to continue the work and make this vision of the beloved community a living, vibrant reality. To that, I say, amen. And the people say, amen.